I hope you can hear me well. If there's any problem with sound and audio, please shoot a message into the chat, into the window pane, the question pane. Sorry for the delay. We had to figure out a couple of connection issues, but I think we seem to be good now. So I would like to officially say good morning or good afternoon to everyone present in this webinar. Maybe before we start, some housekeeping rules. And for that, I will upload a slide. So waiting for the slide to upload, I would like to inform you that the webinar will be recorded and made available to you afterwards and be distributed through the channels that we also use to advertise the webinar. So if you should have a problem with the fact that this webinar is recorded, then yeah, you should leave the chat now, I guess. And otherwise, this will be made public, as I said. Then, first of all, please note also that you have a control panel. So here we're using the GoToWebinar license, which has a control panel on your left-hand side. And there are different functions. You can notably choose the language of your of the webinar window and session. But most of all, you can raise your hand. You have a questions pane, window pane, where you can post your questions as we go through the inputs, as we have the presentation, so that as soon as you have a question, we can post it and then we can address it afterwards during the Q&A session. I'm setting up the rule that I will mostly collect the questions throughout the webinar and I will ask them for you. So please, when you post a question, maybe also post the organization or the country you are in, so that we also have a little bit of the context and background. And please, if you still would like to make a contribution, have a remark, have an experience to share, raise your hand so that I can see who wants to talk and so that I can unmute you, because you are all automatically muted for now. But when we start the Q&A session, I can unmute those who would like to speak up. All right, I think that's it for the housekeeping rules. Let's have a look at the agenda. So as we announced also in the weeks prior to the webinar, we have two inputs today. We are trying to stick with a maximum of 30 minutes speaking, and then we have ideally another 30 minutes for exchange Q&A. So we'll start with an overview of the risk supplement to the vulnerability source book. And then we will get a country insight from the Philippines on how they're integrating vulnerability and climate change into land use planning. And then, as I said, we will have Q&A and discussion session, hopefully as long as the input session. So maybe to provide a little bit of background and why we're doing this webinar. So basically, a year ago, we had also a webinar in the frame of the SNRD Asia Climate Change Adaptation Working Group, where we first talked about the risk methodology, the AR5 definition, part of the IPCC's report. And we already had Susanne as a speaker, who will be our first speaker today, introducing or announcing that GIZ had decided to work on an extension of its vulnerability source book. And I myself presented our approach here in Thailand on the risk methodology, notably through the development of climate change impact chains that were leaning on the AR5 definition. So here we are 1 year later. The risk supplement is actually out now and has been published and announced and disseminated through various channels. So we're taking this opportunity to introduce it to you in the first part of this webinar before we get the country insight. Also, I'd like to mention that we are actually partnering up with the EbA Community of Practice for this webinar, and for the webinar on the 2nd of November, for several reasons. But we have a lot of working group members who are also EbA practitioners who are part of the working group and also part of the Community of Practice. So we thought that it would make sense to spread the webinar and the announcement of these webinars through both our networks and to organize them jointly. The EbA Community of Practice has also been offering some webinars this year already, and they were planning one on risk assessments in the EbA context. So it fits quite well. So this is the first one, and on 2nd of November, we will have a second webinar that will look at risk assessment specifically in the EbA context, whereas today we're looking more at risk assessments in the policy NAP context. And I'm very pleased to see that we have quite some attendees that are also a little bit from all around the world. We have people from, of course, Asia, since we are the SNRD, so GIZ Sector Network Asia. We also have colleagues from Germany, I can see, and yeah, a couple of other representatives from institutions. And before I leave the floor to our first speaker, let me just introduce them. So we will have Susanne Schwan as our first speaker. Susanne is an advisor for climate change adaptation at GIZ headquarters in Ashbourne and has been working there for around 6 years. She is what we call a planning officer in the Competence Center Climate Change and Environmental Policy, and she mostly advises projects on climate policy, climate risk management. And before that, she also worked within GIZ in the sector program Climate, where she also was involved in the development of the Sourcebook vulnerability, and she was also involved in the conception and the methodology around the development of the risk supplements. So that's why we're having her today to introduce to us the risk supplements. And then the country insights will be held by and presented by Ms. Cecilia Astilla, who is the GIZ senior advisor in the Philippines. It was initially meant to be a representative from the Philippines Housing Land Use Regulatory Board. But according to the latest update, it will be difficult to get Ms. Diaz on board. So Ms. Astilla will kindly take over. Cecilia is a GIZ senior advisor and a specialist in rural development and human resource development. And she is working a lot with the Philippines Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board. Yes, and will tell us more about the Philippines approach in integrating risk into land use planning policies. So without no further ado, I will leave the floor to you, Susanne, and make you present her.
Okay, now I hope that I managed everything with showing the PowerPoint. Just give me a second. You can hear me, right?
Very well.
Okay, perfect. And I think now you can also see the presentation.
Yeah, it's up on my screen and it should be up on everybody else's screen. If you have any problem, please feel free to shoot it through the chat.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much, Marie, for the introduction and for handing over to me. As you said, I will give a very brief introduction to the risk supplement. So risk assessments as a basis for adaptation policy. I will briefly present the new approach, and then also based on our experience with the vulnerability sourcebook, I will just give you some brief insights where we see the benefits of this approach for decision-making and for adaptation policies, because we think that could be helpful as well. Yeah, basically that is the agenda. I explained the approach of the Sourcebook vulnerability and the risk supplement, because actually they only work together. What is the Sourcebook and the risk supplement? Why did we develop it, and how does the approach actually look like? And then, as I said, I give you a brief insight on some benefits or some of our learnings we have so far. So what is the Sourcebook vulnerability? First of all, it's kind of a standardized, modular and practice-oriented approach for vulnerability and now also for risk assessments. As I said, the vulnerability Sourcebook still serves as the main guidance, and in the risk supplement is an addition to the Sourcebook, which helps you applying the same methodology and guidance to the new risk concept, which was introduced by the last or the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. The Sourcebook is scalable to different regional levels, sectors and contexts, and also timeframes. That was really important for us when we developed it, because we are in GIZ handling very different contexts where we do vulnerability assessments, from local, very local assessments on community level, also to national level climate risk or vulnerability assessments. It is also important to emphasize that it provides a framework and not a prescriptive methodology. It is actually more, or should actually be more seen as a guidance, giving you a step-by-step idea how you could do it. But of course, in every step, you could also take another path or take other decisions. And what is also kind of new about what was new when we published the Sourcebook was that it allows for the application of vulnerability and now also for risk assessments for M&E of adaptation. So through the approach of repeating vulnerability assessments, which are documented and in a very transparent manner, it helps you or could help you to also analyze impact of adaptation measures on very different scales. Yeah, and when I talk about the approach now, maybe first, why did we actually develop the Sourcebook and also the risk supplement? I mean, first of all, as you probably know, vulnerability and risk assessments are an integral part and an integral basis also for the National Adaptation Plan process. So that was one of the main ideas behind it as well. And then our idea also was to really transfer experience from Germany with the vulnerability assessment, which has been conducted in the context of Germany's adaptation strategy, to technical cooperation or development cooperation. And that's why our approach actually follows or builds on the approach Germany has chosen for its vulnerability assessment. However, we also have to highlight, and I think that is really interesting, that by now deciding that we are focusing on the 5th assessment report and on the concept of risk, we kind of overturned Germany because they still stick to the older vulnerability concept. Of course, there was also need within GIZ for guidance and for an acknowledged approach. As I mentioned, we have very different contexts in which we apply or conduct vulnerability and risk assessments. And especially in head office, we were dealing with a lot of questions on how could we actually do vulnerability assessments, how do we document it, how could we ensure that they are scientifically valid or sound. Yeah, and the idea for the risk supplement actually came when the IPCC came out with this new risks concept. And we actually see a great benefit in the fact that the risk concept now promoted tries to adopt the, let's say, the language and concepts of the disaster risk reduction community. And by thus, it also helps the two communities kind of speak the same language. And of course, that can be of great benefit. And also, it gains more and more importance in the international sphere and gains more acceptance by the international community. So another advantage of the risk concept we see is that it helps strengthen efforts to determine likelihoods of potential consequences. It is, of course, often very, very difficult in the context of climate change to determine likelihoods of a potential risk to actually occur, but the risk concept kind of helps or encourages us to do that more strongly. Yeah, and the risk supplement we developed helps bridging the gap between the vulnerability concept, which was promoted before, especially in the 4th assessment report of the IPCC, and the risk concept, which is promoted today. And just to give you a brief insight into the approach, which will now only based on the conceptual ideas behind the risk supplement and the new risk concept. Obviously, it builds on the risk concept which is promoted by the IPCC. Basically, risk is the outcome or the main result we are looking at, and the risk is understood as potential consequences where something of value is at stake and where the outcome is uncertain. That's why we also talk more about probability or think about probability. The risk components are exposure, vulnerability, and hazard. And what is very important to mention in contrast to the old concept of vulnerability, vulnerability here as a risk component has a very different meaning, and I think that is especially important for the climate risk community to understand. Vulnerability is understood as the predisposition to be adversely affected, and it can actually, when we think about the old concept, be understood as a concept composed of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And exposure, of course, is the presence of people, assets, or ecosystems in areas of risk, and hazard is the climate signal. So really important, or the key element of the Sourcebook and also of the risk supplement are so-called climate impact chains or cause and effect chains, which are composed of the risk components and underlying factors of these risk components. So underlying factors which determine vulnerability, be it sensitivity or adaptive capacity or coping capacity, and underlying factors which define exposure to a specific risk. To give you a brief idea of the whole supplement of the steps which should be taken, I'm showing here the different modules of the risk supplement and of the vulnerability sourcebook. The key first step is really preparing the risk assessment, defining the focus of what you actually want to analyze. And already the second step is developing impact chains. They really help you understanding a system and also the interactions between a system. And they also can help you at a later stage to identify adaptation measures. As a second step, as a third step, in order to quantify the underlying factors of your impact chains, it's about the third module is about identifying and selecting indicators. Then, of course, data acquisition and management. The Sourcebook and the risk supplement actually give a very good or suggest a very good and clear way how you could structure your data, also to enable a repetition of the vulnerability assessment and also to do the whole vulnerability assessment in a very transparent way. Module 5 introduces normalization and threshold definition. Of course, we are dealing with very different quantities. For some indicators, we may use qualitative measures such as focus interviews or expert interviews, and for some indicators, we might have good quantitative data such as hydrological models. And actually, the fifth module helps you to normalize and helps you to normalize all these values to enable you to combine them in one measure in the end. Module 6 gives an introduction to weighting and aggregation. I briefly introduce it in the next slide. And then as a last outcome, of course, we aggregate all the risk components to risk. And what should also not be forgotten is that presenting outcomes and how they are presented is key also for how to use these results. I briefly said that vulnerability impact chains also help you to identify adaptation measures. This is just to briefly visualize where adaptation actually kind of comes in. Most importantly, obviously, adaptation helps to decrease either sensitivity or helps to increase adaptive capacity. And in rare cases, of course, adaptation can also help to decrease deposure. That's why we also have only have a dotted line here, because exposure can actually only be reduced if you, for example, migrate or move people to other places or move assets of value to other places. So it's very rare that we deal with exposure, but sometimes, of course, we do that as well. So what I said in the beginning, of course, the main outcome, many people and also many policymakers are looking at a quantitative outcomes or a quantification of risk. So in the end, the risk supplement helps you to aggregate all your risk components and the underlying factors. We use weighted arithmetic aggregation for that. That is explained in detail in the risk supplement. And I only want to mention a word of caution. We've seen a lot of cases where actually the whole process of developing impact chains and discussing indicators, etc., may be even more important than just the composite indicator of risk in the end. And it can also be, let's say, the risk indicator can hide very important underlying factors. That's why we also often highlight and state that what should be communicated in the end is not only the risk indicator or the index, but also its underlying component to really show different dimensions. And especially, for example, if you repeat a vulnerability assessment in order to monitor your adaptation measures, it is really important to see what has actually changed, which indicators have actually changed and what has worked. The bare number of risk can probably doesn't give a lot of insight into that. So now very briefly on some key learnings for decision-making and adaptation policies. What are the benefits of the approach? As I said in the beginning, the key elements of the Sourcebook and also of the risk supplement are impact chains. And they are especially of value if you develop them in a participatory manner with policymakers and experts, for example, or also with communities on the ground. They help participants really to understand the systems, its interactions, and how and why something changes. An indicator doesn't really show how and why something changes. It just gives you an indication of a status. But the impact chains can really help you to understand more the systemic approach. It also helps realizing climate variability and change are not the only drivers of risk. Often, of course, we see that unsustainable practices of resource management are a key driver of risk. And for some policymakers, it might be a very reasonable and important insight that it's not only climate change, but also development practices which drive risk. And lastly, impact chains help to learn how climate change actually affects development and how risk can be reduced. As I said, we can use them for identifying adaptation measures, and that this learning and understanding is sometimes even more important than the results of an assessment. We had, for example, a very nice example from Thailand where they had sectors together to develop the impact chains and the realization during that development how important it is that sectors cooperate between each other and that you cannot see every sector in silos when it comes to adaptation. So you could also say that the path is actually the goal or one of the goals conducting risk assessments. And last slide, some further benefits we see, especially when you develop impact chains in a participatory manner. Involvement of policymakers and participants increases the acceptance and the use of the results for actually policymaking or decision making. We should bear in mind that results are often used for political purposes. Sometimes vulnerability assessments are conducted with a clear idea in mind to, for example, invest in big infrastructure. And if a vulnerability assessment gives some uncomfortable, let's say uncomfortable results for that particular purpose, you can be quite sure that when you involved participants and when you have a transparent approach how you do your risk or vulnerability assessment, that results are much better used and when the underlying approach is understood. So involvement is also really the basis for legitimizing or for the legitimization of costly adaptation measures. And we also here have a very nice example from Tanzania, where we conducted a risk assessment. There was a basin water board officer who actually wanted the risk assessment to, as I said, to argue for big infrastructure and for additional finance. But the results demonstrated that small and medium-sized measures may be very effective in the water basin where the risk assessment was applied. And in the end, and we think it's mainly due to his participation, he had buy-in in the approach and also ownership for the results, and the results were actually used for developing small and medium measures. So that's from my side. I'm happy to answer questions later after the second presentation. And I just want to highlight that the vulnerability sourcebook and the risk assessment are available at the Adaptation community. I also would like to highlight that we will probably have an exchange on risk assessments also with consultants, not only GIZ, but also external consultants at the FATA, which will be in summer next year. And I also encourage all of you who conduct vulnerability and risk assessments to share your results within GIZ as part of the product climate. And I think when we distribute the documentation of this webinar, we will also make sure that you have the link. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for the very interesting inputs. And so basically we conducted or we organized the webinar in such a way as to have a little bit, let's say, the theory first to start off with, right, on the risk approach and how the risk supplement now leans on this risk approach. And what changed, right, in conducting such an assessment, leaning on the IPCC's definition and approach. And now we want to actually look at a concrete case. As I mentioned in the introduction, we will have an input from the Philippines on exactly this, namely the integration of the risk approach into a concrete sector and policy sector, notably the disaster risk reduction sector and the land use planning. And so with no further ado, I will give the floor to Cecilia, who will kindly present the slides from Nora Diaz, who was initially meant to present that. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie. Good afternoon, everyone. Presenting how the House regulatory attempts to maintain disaster risk analysis for planning in the Philippines, an example unit in the province of Mindoro. Next slide, please. So, am I coming in clear?
It's not too bad. Let's go ahead.
Okay, the second slide. Siya nag-manage, di ba? Okay, the second slide shows us that in the process of updating or doing the comprehensive land use plan at the municipal or town level, the climate change and disaster risk analysis happens in the fourth step of the 12 step in doing the comprehensive land use planning, and climate change disaster risk analysis happens at the situational analysis step, which is the fourth. Slide, we will the disaster risk covered by the vulnerability and risk assessment looks at 5 areas: the lifeline utilities, which consist of the transportation, water distribution, drainage and power, and communication network. The second area would be the communities, and this would be the schools, hospitals, the rural health units, and the local government unit buildings. Of course, systems in the area, resource-based production is being undertaken. This would mean the agriculture, the forest lands, the coastal and marine fishery resource area. And then for the urban, that would mean the built environment, which covers residential, commercial, industrial, tourism, sanitary waste management facilities, and cemeteries. And lastly, we also look at the population. They are located number of potentially affected persons. And then the local government units are taught by the HLURB, or the Housing and Land Use Regulatory Board planning, regional planning teams, how to use the climate change projections from the Department of Science and Technology, our and we call it PAG-ASA. It's the Philippine Atmospheric Geophysical and Astronomical Services Administration. So they are the officially mandated unit in the Philippines to do climate projections. We also consider the records of previous disaster, hazard events, description, including the affected barangay, the casualties, the damage to properties and houses, including incomes. So for areas where agriculture, fishery, and forestry are the main economic drivers, the loss and damages are also being factored in. And then the third area would be the projected changes in climate variables and potential affected exposure units. And lastly, they do a climate impact chain diagram that includes the biophysical and socioeconomic impacts. So this is an example of so this shows us, this slide shows us what would be the data that's included in the exposure, in the sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And the exercise we did with the HLURB is essentially to look at whether the guidelines that they have just updated in 2014, that mainstream climate and disaster risk assessment would still contain the information that they need to shift to using the AR5 results or framework. And we have found out that the same information, what you have in exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity would still be present using the AR5. You might be noticing that there is the literacy. The literacy has been placed in the adaptive capacity because it also gives us an idea in the understanding of the communities for climate change information and trying to, for themselves, trying to propose the adaptation measures that they will be taking. So, next slide is an example. Marie, next slide. No, forward. We just finished this, so these are the climate information we're getting from the national agencies. Okay, so this is an example of the exposure data and already including their scores per hazard. So you will see here if the landslide susceptibility, the likelihood of occurrence, the area that will be affected, the dominant crop, and then in hectareage, how many hectares will be exposed, and then the percentage of the exposure, the potential income, and the exposed value. So these are done by the local government unit planning teams. And then the next slide. Okay, this one just shows us the examples of the likelihood of occurrence scores. So they compute for this and then they put a score on it. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the local level, they already have policy interventions, and then they also arrive at climate change adaptation per sector and disaster risk reduction measures. Next slide, please. So here this slide shows which area is going to be affected. So these are their technical findings. So for example, there is a multi-purpose hall that is not susceptible to flooding, and then the area is prone to low susceptibility for flooding, the health center, and then the other critical point facilities. So, and they come to the column on the implications. What does it mean if they have these technical findings? So one of which is that the facilities that are exposed to hazard are not safe for evacuation centers, and therefore the policy intervention would be establishing evacuation centers that are on safer grounds, or that the evacuation centers that are relatively safe would need to be fortified. So these policy interventions flow into their comprehensive development plan, where they can put in some investment costs they need to do the measures. Next slide, please. For lifeline utilities, they chose a national road, and they have indicated the kilometers that are really exposed or highly susceptible for flooding, and which are moderate. And then, of course, the implications would be really major disruption in transporting goods and services, and also the difficulty in quick response. And so their policy intervention, you would see, is establishing alternative routes and formulating flood contingency plans, targeting the potentially affected communities. Next slide, please. Oh, that's the last slide. Thank you. Hello.
All right, thank you, Cecilia, for the presentation from Manila, the Philippines, I assume. I hope the sound was fine to everyone. I think it got actually very good towards the middle up until now, so I hope it was the case for everyone else in the webinar room. So this was our second input, where, as promised, we had a look into a very concrete application of the risk assessment. Here was a case study from the Philippines at a quite local scale, but most likely it was the probability of or the possibility of scaling up. So now we would start our Q&A session. We started a bit late, and the presentation were also a tiny bit longer than anticipated. So I would say that we go for 20 minutes Q&A session, so that if people have appointments, can still make them, but can still also listen into the Q&A. So I was just looking at the questions pane, and I have not seen any contextual question yet. So maybe you either want to type in your questions now, or you raise your hand and I unmute your mic so that you can speak up and address your questions directly to one of our speakers. Is there anyone in the chat room who would like to ask a question to either Susanna or Cecilia? I still don't see anyone. Maybe I will start off with a question, because I actually have one for Cecilia, for our colleagues in the Philippines. I really thought that your presentation was very interesting. And I was wondering about two things. You mentioned that basically switching from AR4 to AR5, so including really the risk approach, didn't change a lot in the data you needed to collect. But then you also mentioned that you included loss and damage. So I was wondering whether the loss and damage dimension was captured in the risk factors. This would be my question number one. And then I was also wondering who you meant by they. When you presented the exposure factors and the scoring, notably, you said that they scored and they also basically agreed on the most susceptible or exposed factors. Were these the local leaders, the local land use planners? Like, with whom did you basically agreed on the exposed elements and also their susceptibility to physical climate impacts? That would be my two questions.
Okay, the first question is that the local government units planning team. Sorry, on the loss and damage, it's from the physical impacts.
Part of the risk dimension, right?
Yeah. The local planning team consists of the different offices, like the agriculture and fishery representative, also the environment officer of at the local level, plus the planning coordinator. They will look at past data as well. So if the local level is usually visited by typhoons, they have record of the loss and damages that occurred for typhoons.
Okay, and maybe as a follow-up question, the land use planning units at the national and local levels in the Philippines have a mandate to actually look at climate impacts, climate changes, climate variability, or did they increasingly got into that field and have an unofficial mandate?
There are official mandates for the national agencies, and information that are generated by these agencies are used at the local level.
All right. Thank you, Cecilia. Are there any other questions? I still can't see any question in the question pane.
Actually, Marie, can I just speak?
Yeah.
This is Suzanne. Actually, if there's no questions from the participants, I would have a question to the participants, and I hope they would answer, because I would be interested who actually currently conducts a vulnerability or a risk assessment, or who has already conducted one. Because for us in head offices, it is of course always very helpful to get an overview where vulnerability or risk assessments are being conducted. So if so, I would be very grateful if you could either raise your hand here or send us an email. But it would, if there is someone who already conducts one, it would also be interesting to learn if you decided for vulnerability or for a risk assessment, and if so, why? And actually, I would also be interested to hear that from our colleagues from the Philippines, what your considerations behind the decision to go for one or the other concept was. I hope the participants are still with us.
I can see that there was a comment from Tim, who is a GIZ colleague from Ashbourne, stating that he has no direct question yet, but that he would like to liaise with you, Susanne, later on, because he's still sitting in Ashbourne, but will soon move to Vietnam, and will be happy in the future to share insights on EbA vulnerability and risk assessments in Vietnam.
Okay,
so
great.
That's good to know. Yeah, that's good to know for future webinars, for sure, and for future exchanges. And also Harold, another colleague from Vietnam, is stating that actually Vietnam, did EbA vulnerability assessments in the country. I think it was done by GIZ.
Yeah, I think that, it was done probably also with support from our colleagues. As I said before, it would also be great if you could share your results in the Produktklima, as we say. I'm looking forward to see further sharing also of results and experience.
Yes, and we are also, as part of the SNRD working group, we're exactly looking to sharing these type of practices, and if you conduct vulnerability or risk assessments, these are very key topics when you think about adaptation policy making, because they inform very directly policymakers in the climate change fields, and it doesn't have necessarily to be in the Asian region. Although, of course, the working group that we have under the SNRD Asia has a strong focus, a regional focus on the Southeast Asian region, just as a side note. Okay, I'm still not seeing anyone raising his hand. Just reminding you that I can unmute you if you want. Harold is just mentioning that the final report on the EbA risk assessment or vulnerability assessment is still being done.
Okay, great.
All right, that would be a last shout to everyone here in the webinar. If there are not any additional question. I see that Tim would like to have more information on the vulnerability assessment in Vietnam, but maybe you can contact Harold for that directly. Or if Harold wants to unmute himself and share something live, that's also possible. Okay, then I will, I can unmute you actually, Harold. There you go.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm the wrong person to give detailed information about the VA. I have been involved in some technical aspects, and what I'm doing now, I'm cleaning up the database that has been compiled by the VA team, and it will be handed over to the our partner institutions in the 2 provinces, hopefully in December. The reports are now under construction, especially the Vietnamese version, to make it exactly the same regarding content and layout as the English version.
Okay, thank you, Harold, for the intervention. There was a little bit of background noise. I'm not sure everyone got everything, but I understood that the reports would be handed in to the partner institution by the end of the year. So I guess they will be publicly available then, probably to be shared, or yeah, they can be maybe also the object of another knowledge exchange and webinar. And of course, feel free to connect bilaterally again. Of course, we'll share the presentations afterwards. So this was part of my final note, but I can maybe also mention it now that we will share the 2 presentations that you just saw during the 2 inputs, as well as the recorded file. We'll for sure post it in on the SNRD websites, but I will circulate the links to you as we did for the webinar announcement. And also, because we just unmuted Harold, I would like to just advertise that we'll have another webinar, except for the one on the 2nd of November. We'll have one probably on the 8th or the 9th on something very related that looks more at the technical aspects of doing risk assessments and collecting data. It will be on the QGIS software, which is a mapping software. And we will have several insights. Harold will moderate the session, and he will present how the software was used in the Vietnamese context. But we'll have also user experience from India and the Philippines, I believe. So yeah, this will happen on the 8th of November. For those who are interested also in looking actually at the software producing the vulnerability maps, the risk maps, and there are a lot of software modules out there that are also free of charge, but of course you have to know how to use them a little bit. And so we'll not have a full-on webinar training you to use these softwares, but we'll show some applications and also some lessons learned, best practices in using the software. That might be also something very interesting for partner institutions and governments that you're working with or supporting. All right, is there any other question? There are no hands raised. I can't see anything in the question pane neither. So if no other question, I will say that we leave it here. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We, as I mentioned, will make available the presentations and the recorded file. If there are any follow-up question, or if we would like to connect to any of the speakers, the attendees, please feel free to contact me and I can create the links. And yes, thank you very much for attending. I hope it was a useful information and input to all of you, and I wish you a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.